The vanishing of the Roanoke Colony, America's oldest unsolved mystery. In the late summer of 1590, a ship carrying English colonists approached the shores of Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. The passengers were returning after a 3-year absence, eager to reunite with the friends and family they had left behind. But as they stepped onto the sandy beach, an eerie silence greeted them. No voices called out in welcome. No children ran to embrace their returning relatives. The settlement stood empty, abandoned, as if its inhabitants had simply vanished into thin air. This is the story of the lost colony of Roanoke, a mystery that has haunted historians, archaeologists, and amateur sleuths for over 4 centuries. It's a tale that combines ambition and tragedy, hope and despair, and ultimately an enigma that remains unsolved to this day. What happened to the 115 men, women, and children who disappeared without a trace? Did they perish in conflict? Were they absorbed into Native American tribes? Or did something far stranger claim their fate? The Roanoke mystery stands as America's oldest cold case, a historical puzzle that predates the founding of Jamestown and the arrival of the Mayflower. It represents not just a missing group of people, but a missing chapter in the story of early American colonization, a chapter whose ending was torn out before anyone could read it. As we delve into this 5-century-old mystery, we'll examine the historical context that led to the colony's establishment, the people who risked everything to build a new life in an unknown land, the clues they left behind, and the countless theories that have emerged trying to explain their disappearance. We'll explore recent archaeological discoveries that may finally shed light on their fate, and consider why this particular mystery continues to captivate our imagination. The story of Roanoke is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a reminder of the fragility of human endeavors, the courage of early explorers, and the mysteries that still exist in our well-documented world. It challenges us to confront the unknown and accept that some questions may never have definitive answers. So join me as we journey back to the late 16th century, to a small island off the American coast, where over 100 souls vanished, leaving behind only cryptic clues and endless questions. Chapter 1. The stage is set. To understand the mystery of Roanoke, we must first understand the world that created it. The late 1500s were a time of extraordinary exploration and expansion. European powers were racing to claim territories in the New World, driven by desires for wealth, religious freedom, and national prestige. Spain had already established a significant presence in the Americas, extracting vast quantities of gold and silver from its colonies. England, under Queen Elizabeth I, watched with envious eyes. Enter Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, a man of ambition, charm, and vision. In 1584, Raleigh received a royal charter granting him the right to explore and colonize lands in North America. Unlike the Spanish, who sought primarily to extract wealth, Raleigh envisioned something different: permanent English settlements that would serve as bases for trade, military operations against Spanish interests, and eventual expansion. Raleigh sponsored an initial reconnaissance expedition that same year, led by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow. The explorers returned with glowing reports of a land they called Virginia, named in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. They described fertile soil, abundant resources, and native peoples who seemed friendly and welcoming. The indigenous Algonquian tribes of the region had their own complex societies, political structures, and ways of life that had existed for thousands of years. The English understanding of these cultures was superficial at best, colored by European assumptions and prejudices that would later prove catastrophic. Encouraged by these reports, Raleigh organized a first colonization attempt in 1585. He appointed Ralph Lane as governor and sent over 100 colonists to Roanoke Island. This first colony was primarily military in nature, composed mostly men, with the intention of establishing a fortified presence. The expedition was led by Sir Richard Grenville, a cousin of Raleigh's and an experienced naval commander. The 1585 colony struggled from the start. The colonists arrived too late in the season to plant crops. Relations with the CROATOAN and CROATOAN peoples, initially friendly, deteriorated rapidly. The English exhibited a combination of arrogance and paranoia that alienated potential allies. When they suspected the CROATOAN chief Winyana of plotting against them, Lane ordered a preemptive strike that resulted in Winyana's death, an act that would poison relations with the indigenous population. Food shortages became critical. The colonists had arrived expecting to find easy wealth, or at least abundant resources requiring little effort to exploit. Instead, they found themselves in a complex ecosystem that demanded knowledge, skills, and hard work they hadn't anticipated. The promise of gold and jewels proved illusory. Morale plummeted. Disease and malnutrition took their toll. When Sir Francis Drake happened to pass by Roanoke in June 1586, returning from raids on Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, Lane and his colonists eagerly abandoned the settlement and returned to England. The first attempt at English colonization in America had failed, barely lasting a year. But the story doesn't end there. Despite this failure, Raleigh remained committed to his vision. He began planning a second expedition, but this time with a different approach. Rather than a military outpost, the new colony would be a true settlement, families building homes and lives in the New World. This colony would be led by John White, an artist and cartographer who had been on the 1585 expedition and had shown more sensitivity to the indigenous cultures than most of his contemporaries. White recruited colonists with a different profile than the previous expedition. Rather than soldiers and fortune seekers, he gathered farmers, craftsmen, and family groups, people willing to work the land and build a community. Among them was White's own pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias. The colonists numbered 115 in total, including women and children, a clear indication that this was intended for a permanent settlement, not a temporary military installation. The plan called for the colony to be established on the Chesapeake Bay, which offered a better harbor and more resources than Roanoke Island. However, the ship's pilot, Simón Fernández, had other priorities. Fernández wanted to continue on to privateering activities, attacking Spanish ships and settlements. Whether through malice, impatience, or pragmatic calculation, Fernández refused to take the colonists farther than Roanoke, insisting they disembark there. So, in July 1587, John White and his 115 colonists found themselves on Roanoke Island, the site of the previous failed colony, an island where relations with the native population had been poisoned by violence and mistrust. They were in the wrong location, arriving late in the season, with limited supplies, and surrounded by potentially hostile neighbors who remembered English betrayal. The stage was set for either triumph or tragedy. As history would prove, it would be neither. It would be something far stranger, a complete and utter vanishing.
The colony and the departure. Despite the inauspicious beginning, the colonists set to work with determination. They repaired the buildings left behind by Lane's expedition, planted crops, and began establishing relationships with the nearby CROATOAN tribe, who had remained relatively friendly to the English. The CROATOAN chief, Montejo, had actually traveled to England with the previous expedition and returned with White's group. Montejo served as an interpreter and intermediary, baptized into the Christian faith, and given the title Lord of Roanoke. His presence offered hope that peaceful coexistence might be possible. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, christened Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. The birth must have seemed like a good omen, a symbol of new beginnings and the promise of generations to come. The colonists held a celebration, perhaps allowing themselves to believe that their venture might succeed where the previous one had failed. But the reality of their situation was precarious. Food supplies were running dangerously low. The colonists had arrived too late to plant sufficient crops for the coming winter. The nearby tribes, with the exception of the CROATOAN, remained wary or openly hostile. The colonists faced the very real prospect of starvation if they didn't receive supplies from England before winter. After much discussion, the colonists made a fateful decision. They would send John White back to England to organize a supply mission. White initially resisted. He didn't want to abandon the colony, especially with his daughter and newborn granddaughter among the settlers. But the colonists insisted that as their governor and the expedition's organizer, White had the best chance of securing the needed support from Raleigh and convincing investors that the colony was worth continued investment. Before departing, White and the colonists agreed on a communication system. If the colonists were forced to relocate, they would carve the name of their destination on a prominent tree or post. If they left under duress or in danger, they would carve a Maltese cross above the name as a distress signal. This simple arrangement would later become one of the most analyzed aspects of the entire mystery. John White sailed from Roanoke on August 27, 1587, leaving behind his family and 114 other colonists. He expected to return within a few months with supplies and additional settlers. He had no way of knowing that it would be 3 years before he set foot on Roanoke Island again, and when he did, he would find only ghosts and questions. The delay in White's return wasn't due to lack of effort on his part. He arrived in England in November 1587 and immediately began organizing a relief expedition, but history intervened in the form of international conflict. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain launched the Spanish Armada, a massive fleet intended to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth. Every available English ship was pressed into service to defend the realm. Raleigh's plans for resupplying Roanoke were considered insignificant compared to the existential threat facing England. White managed to arrange for 2 small ships to attempt the crossing in 1588, but the captains, more interested in privateering than colony relief, engaged Spanish vessels in the Caribbean and were forced to turn back after sustaining damage. The supplies meant for Roanoke never left the Caribbean waters. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in August 1588 was a triumphant moment for England, but it didn't immediately free up resources for Roanoke. The war with Spain continued. Ships and sailors remained in high demand. White grew increasingly desperate, his letters to Raleigh becoming more frantic as months stretched into years. He was haunted by thoughts of his daughter, granddaughter, and the other colonists, wondering if they still lived, if they blamed him for abandoning them, if they understood that he was doing everything in his power to return. Finally, in March 1590, White secured passage on a privateering expedition led by John Watts. The agreement was that after engaging in profitable raids on Spanish holdings, the ships would detour to Roanoke. It wasn't ideal. White would have preferred a dedicated relief mission, but after 3 years, he was willing to accept any opportunity to return. The voyage was long and fraught with delays. The privateers prioritized their own activities, and reaching Roanoke remained a secondary objective. White spent months in frustration as the ships raided Spanish settlements and chased prizes in the Caribbean. He could only imagine what was happening on Roanoke, whether the colonists had survived, whether his family still waited for his return. As the ships finally turned north toward the Carolina coast in August 1590, White must have felt a mixture of hope and dread. 3 years was a long time. Much could have happened, but he allowed himself to hope. Perhaps the colonists had thrived, establishing trade with friendly tribes, harvesting successful crops, building a thriving community. Perhaps his granddaughter Virginia, who would now be 3 years old, would run to greet him. Perhaps his daughter Eleanor would forgive him for the long delay. On August 15, 1590, the ships anchored on Roanoke Island. As White and the crew rowed toward shore, they saw smoke rising in the distance. White's heart must have leapt. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant the colony had survived. The crew sang English songs loudly, hoping to signal their friendly approach and avoid being mistaken for enemies. But as they drew closer, no answering calls greeted them. The beach remained empty. The settlement appeared deserted. And John White was about to discover a mystery that would perplex investigators for the next 400 years.
Chapter 3. The Discovery. August 16, 1590, dawned with John White and his companions anxiously approaching Roanoke Island. The smoke they had seen the previous evening had proven to be from a forest fire, not from the colonists' hearths. As they made their way through the island, White noticed something that made his pulse quicken: fresh footprints in the sand. Someone had been here recently. His hopes rose again. The party proceeded inland toward the settlement. The path, once clear, was now overgrown, suggesting that it hadn't been used regularly in some time. When they finally reached the site of the colony, what they found was both puzzling and disturbing. The settlement had been deliberately dismantled. This wasn't the chaos of a hasty evacuation or the destruction of an attack. The houses had been carefully taken down, presumably so the materials could be moved elsewhere. A palisade, a defensive wall of logs, had been constructed around the perimeter, suggesting that at some point the colonists had felt threatened enough to fortify that position. But there was no sign of battle, no bones or bodies, no bloodstains or weapon marks indicating violence. White searched desperately for some sign of what had happened. Then he found it. Carved into a post at the entrance to the palisade was a single word: CROATOAN. The letters were clear and deliberately carved, not hastily scratched. Significantly, there was no Maltese cross, no sign of distress. Earlier in his search, White had found another carving on a tree. The letters CRO had been carved into the bark, perhaps an abbreviation of the same message, or perhaps carved by someone interrupted before they could finish. According to the agreement White had made with the colonists before his departure, this message indicated they had relocated to CROATOAN Island, modern-day Hatteras Island, where Manteo's people lived. The absence of a distress symbol suggested they had gone willingly, perhaps seeking the protection and assistance of their CROATOAN allies. White desperately wanted to sail immediately to CROATOAN Island to search for the colonists. He was convinced they were there, living among Manteo's people, waiting to be reunited with English civilization. He could almost imagine his daughter and granddaughter safe with the friendly CROATOAN tribe. But fate had one more cruel twist in store. That evening, a massive storm began building off the coast. The ship's captains, concerned about the approaching hurricane season and worried about their vessels, insisted on leaving immediately. White argued passionately for just a brief detour to CROATOAN, only 50 miles away. He begged, he pleaded, he offered bribes from his own pocket. The captains agreed to attempt the voyage to CROATOAN the next day, but the storm worsened overnight. One ship lost several anchors and nearly ran aground. As conditions deteriorated, the captains made their final decision. They would sail immediately for the Caribbean to resupply and repair, then return to search CROATOAN. White had no choice but to agree. He took one last look at Roanoke Island, at the word CROATOAN carved into the post, and boarded the ship. As they sailed south, he surely believed that this was just a temporary delay, that he would return soon to complete his search and finally reunite with his family. But he never returned. The ships reached the Caribbean, but weather, damage, and the demands of privateering prevented the promised return voyage to CROATOAN. Eventually, the expedition returned to England, and John White, now an old man, found himself back where he started, separated from his family, haunted by questions about their fate. White spent his remaining years writing letters, pleading for someone to mount a search expedition to CROATOAN, but no one came forward with the resources or the will. England's focus had shifted. Raleigh faced political troubles and eventually lost his position at court. The fate of 115 colonists on a remote island seemed insignificant compared to the larger currents of European politics. John White died sometime around 1593, never knowing what happened to his daughter, his granddaughter, or the other colonists. The word CROATOAN would be the last message from the lost colony, a clue that pointed towards a solution, but was never followed to its conclusion. Chapter 4: Theories and Speculation. For over 400 years, historians, archaeologists, amateur researchers, and curious minds have proposed countless theories about what happened to the lost colony. Let's examine the major hypotheses, from the most plausible to the most fantastical. Theory 1: Integration with native tribes. The most historically supported theory is that the colonists relocated to CROATOAN Island and gradually integrated with Manteo's people. The CROATOAN alibing, the absence of a distress signal, and the orderly dismantling of the settlement all support this interpretation. Further evidence comes from later accounts. In 1607, when English colonists established Jamestown, they heard persistent rumors from local tribes about people matching the description of the Roanoke colonists living among various indigenous groups. Chief Powhatan allegedly told Captain John Smith that he had massacred a group of English settlers living in a place called Okanawan, but the details don't quite match the Roanoke timeline or location. In the 1650s, English explorer John Lawson encountered Hatteras Indians, descendants of the CROATOAN, who claimed English ancestry. He noted that some had gray eyes, extremely unusual for Native Americans, and that they said their ancestors could talk in a book, suggesting literacy. Some tribal members bore English surnames like Dare and Cooper, names that matched Roanoke colonists. DNA studies of modern Lumbee people who claim partial descent from the lost colony have shown genetic markers consistent with European ancestry dating to approximately the right time period, though the evidence isn't conclusive. Theory 2: The Chesapeake Massacre. Some historians the colonists attempted to reach their original destination, Chesapeake Bay. Evidence suggests that at least some colonists may have traveled north to establish a settlement in the Chesapeake region. Archaeological excavations at a site near the Chowan River have uncovered artifacts consistent with late 16th century English origin, including a rapier handle and other items that could have belonged to the Roanoke colonists. According to this theory,
the colonists established a settlement in the Chesapeake area and lived there for several years. Then, shortly before the Jamestown colonists arrived in 1607, Chief Powhatan ordered their destruction, seeing them as a potential threat or as allies to rival tribes. This would explain the rumors Captain John Smith heard, and Powhatan's cryptic references to killing English settlers.
Starvation and disease. A grimmer possibility is that the colonists simply didn't survive long after White's departure. The late 1580s coincided with the worst drought in the region in 800 years, a fact confirmed by tree ring analysis conducted in the 1990s. Even experienced indigenous farmers struggled during this period. The English colonists, inexperienced with the local environment and lacking established food stores, would have been particularly vulnerable. Disease is another likely factor. European diseases devastated Native American populations throughout the colonial period. But the reverse was also true. Europeans had little immunity to certain diseases present in the New World. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses could have decimated the colony. However, this theory doesn't fully explain the orderly dismantling of the settlement, or the CROATOAN message. If the colonists were dying of starvation or disease, why would they have the strength and organization to move to a new location? Theory 4. Spanish attack. Spain jealously guarded its claim to the Americas and viewed English colonies as both trespassing and potential basis for privateering attacks. Spanish records from the period show that Spain was aware of Roanoke's existence and considered destroying it. In 1588, a Spanish reconnaissance mission was sent to locate and destroy the English colony. However, the mission failed to find Roanoke, possibly searching in the wrong location. Could a later Spanish expedition have succeeded where the first failed? The evidence for this theory is weak. There's no sign of battle at the Roanoke site, no Spanish records claiming the colony's destruction, and no remains suggesting a massacre. The careful dismantling of the settlement doesn't match the aftermath of a military attack. Theory 5. Split into multiple groups. Perhaps the colony didn't have a single fate. Some researchers propose that the colonists split into several groups, each seeking survival in different ways. Some may have gone to CROATOAN Island, others may have attempted to reach Chesapeake Bay, while still others might have sought refuge with different tribal groups. This theory could explain the conflicting evidence and varied reports that later English colonists received. It would also reflect a practical response to resource scarcity. Smaller groups would be easier to feed and integrate into existing native communities. Theory 6. The Dare Stones. In the 1930s, a series of stones were allegedly discovered bearing messages from Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter. The first stone, found near the Chowan River, was carved with a message explaining that the colonists had moved inland, that most had died from disease and conflict with natives, and that Eleanor's husband and daughter were among the dead. She signed it with her maiden name, Eleanor White. The discovery caused a sensation. Over the following years, dozens more Dare stones appeared, charting Eleanor's supposed journey across the American South. However, investigations revealed that most of these stones were obvious forgeries, created to capitalize on the publicity of the first stone. While some researchers believe the first stone might be genuine, most historians consider the entire affair an elaborate hoax. Theory 7. Supernatural and fringe theories. As with any enduring mystery, more speculative theories have emerged. Some have suggested alien abduction, transportation to another dimension, or other paranormal explanations. While these make for entertaining fiction, they have no historical or archaeological support and ignore the more mundane, but more plausible explanations involving disease, starvation, and integration with native populations. The most likely scenario. Weighing all the evidence, the most probable explanation is a combination of theories 1 and 5. The colonists, facing food shortages and recognizing their vulnerable position, likely decided to relocate. Some went to CROATOAN Island, seeking the protection of Mantio's people, hence the CROATOAN message. Others may have attempted to reach Chesapeake Bay or sought refuge with different tribal groups. Over time, these smaller groups would have been absorbed into native populations through marriage and cultural integration. Some may have died from disease, starvation, or conflict. Those who survived likely became part of the indigenous communities, their English identity gradually fading over generations, preserved only in physical features like gray eyes, fragments of cultural memory, and perhaps a few English words or names. The drought conditions, the lateness of the season when they arrived, and the poisoned relations with most nearby tribes left them with few options.
Dispersal and integration weren't signs of failure, but rather adaptive strategies for survival in desperate circumstances. What makes the Roanoke mystery enduring isn't that we have no possible explanations. We have several plausible ones. What makes it a mystery is that we lack definitive proof of exactly what happened. The colonists left just enough clues to tantalize us, but not enough to provide certainty.
Modern investigations and discoveries. The mystery of Roanoke never faded from historical consciousness, but in recent decades, new archaeological techniques and renewed investigation have provided tantalizing new clues about the colonists' fate. In 2007, archaeologists from the University of North Carolina began excavating on Hatteras Island, formerly CROATOAN Island, at a site called Cape Creek. What they found was remarkable: a 16th-century gold signet ring used for sealing letters and documents bearing a lion motif. This was precisely the type of object an English colonist would have possessed. Additionally, they discovered a rapier handle, gun parts, and other European artifacts dating to the late 1500s. More intriguingly, these European artifacts were found intermixed with Native American objects, suggesting cohabitation and cultural exchange rather than conflict. The archaeological context indicated that Europeans and indigenous people were living together at this site, supporting the theory that at least some colonists integrated with the Croatan people. In 2012, researchers at the First Colony Foundation made another exciting discovery. While examining John White's original maps of the region using advanced imaging techniques, they found hidden patches that had been applied to the parchment. When these patches were carefully removed, they revealed a small symbol, a four-pointed star, marked at a site near the Albemarle Sound, about 50 miles inland from Roanoke. This led archaeologists to a location now called Site X. Excavations there have uncovered numerous artifacts dating to the late 16th century, including parts of a sword, ceramics of a style used in the 1580s, and other objects that could have belonged to the Roanoke colonists. The location makes strategic sense. It's near fresh water, has fertile land, and offers some protection from coastal storms. These findings suggest that John White might have had a backup plan, a secondary location where colonists could relocate if Roanoke became untenable. The hidden symbol on his map could have indicated this emergency rendezvous point, information he kept secret to prevent Spanish discovery, but marked on his personal map for future reference. In 2015, archaeological work at another site in Bertie County, North Carolina, uncovered a late 16th century iron bar that appeared to be part of a fireplace or smelting operation. Metallurgical analysis confirmed it was of European manufacture, consistent with English metalworking techniques of the 1580s. This site sits near the Chowan River, one of the areas where the Dare Stone was allegedly found. DNA studies have also provided intriguing, if not conclusive, evidence. Genetic analysis of members of the Lumbee tribe have revealed European ancestry markers that could date to the late 16th century. While modern DNA testing can't pinpoint exact dates or definitively link these markers to the Roanoke colonists, the findings are consistent with European Native American intermarriage occurring in the region around the right time period. Perhaps most exciting are recent remote sensing surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry. These non-invasive techniques allow archaeologists to identify potential archaeological sites without excavation. Several promising locations have been identified, showing anomalies consistent with 16th century European settlement patterns. Excavations at these sites are ongoing, and each dig season brings the possibility of new discoveries. Historical documents continue to yield new information as well. Researchers combing through Spanish colonial archives have found references to English presence on the North American coast during the relevant time period, though specific details about Roanoke remain elusive. English records from the early Jamestown period contain additional second-hand accounts of the Roanoke colonists, though separating fact from rumor in these reports is challenging. Oral histories from Native American communities have received renewed attention as well. While oral traditions can be unreliable after many generations, they sometimes preserve accurate historical memory. Several indigenous groups in the region have stories about pale people who came to live among their ancestors. While these accounts are difficult to verify, they add another piece to the puzzle. The cumulative evidence from these investigations paints a picture significantly different from the dramatic tales of mysterious disappearance that often characterize the Roanoke story. Rather than vanishing, the colonists appear to have dispersed, with different groups relocating to multiple sites. Some went to CROATOAN Island, others to the Albemarle Sound region, and possibly others to the Chesapeake area. At these locations, they likely established small settlements and gradually integrated Native American populations. This interpretation is less mysterious than a sudden disappearance, but it's more consistent with the archaeological evidence and with how people actually behave in survival situations. When faced with starvation and isolation, the colonists didn't vanish into thin air. They adapted, moved, and sought alliances with indigenous groups that could help them survive. The work continues. Each excavation season brings the possibility of new discoveries. Modern technology allows archaeologists to analyze artifacts in ways unimaginable even a generation ago. And somewhere in the soil of coastal North Carolina, more clues surely wait to be uncovered. Conclusion. The mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke endures not because we have no possible explanations, but because we have too many.
The truth, as is often the case with history, likely lies somewhere in the messy middle, not as dramatic as alien abduction or as simple as a single massacre, but rather a complex story of survival, adaptation, and cultural integration. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: the colonists didn't simply vanish. They left deliberate messages indicating they were relocating to CROATOAN Island. Archaeological evidence suggests some colonists did reach CROATOAN, while others may have established settlements at inland locations. Over time, these groups likely integrated with various Native American tribes, their English identity gradually fading as they married into indigenous communities and adapted to new ways of life. Their descendants may walk among us today, their European ancestry visible in DNA tests or physical features, their cultural heritage a blend of English and Native American traditions. The blood of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, may flow in the veins of modern Americans who have no idea of their connection to history's most famous lost colonists. The Roanoke mystery reminds us of several important truths. First, that history is often incomplete. Despite our best efforts, some questions may never be fully answered. Second, that the line between civilized and savage, between European and Native American, was never as clear as colonial narrative suggested. The colonists' survival likely depended on abandoning English identity and adapting indigenous ways of life. Third, that what we call mystery often reflects more about the limitations of our evidence than about the strangeness of what actually occurred. The story also speaks to the courage and resilience of those early colonists. They faced unimaginable hardships, disease, starvation, isolation from their homeland, and an uncertain future in a land they barely understood. When their situation became untenable, they made hard choices about how to survive. Those who lived did so by adapting, by forming alliances, and by letting go of their preconceived notions about how life should be lived. John White died never knowing his family's fate, haunted by the word CROATOAN and the reunion that never occurred. But modern research suggests that if he had been able to reach CROATOAN Island in 1590, he might have found his daughter and granddaughter alive, living among Mantiu's people, adapted to new circumstances but surviving nonetheless. The lost colony of Roanoke will likely never be completely solved. There will be no single dramatic discovery that answers every question. Instead, we accumulate clues. An artifact here, a genetic marker there, a piece of documentary evidence somewhere else. Slowly, like a picture emerging from fog, the outline of what happened becomes clearer. And perhaps that's appropriate. The colonists themselves exist for us in outline rather than sharp detail. Brave, flawed, desperate people who stepped into the unknown and became part of the land they sought to claim. Their disappearance into history mirrors their disappearance into the landscape of early America, absorbed and transformed, leaving only traces for us to puzzle over centuries later. The mystery endures, and in enduring it keeps alive the memory of those 115 souls who vanished from Roanoke but never truly disappeared. They became something new, something neither entirely English nor entirely Native American, but a blend of both, a preview of the multicultural nation that America would eventually become. In the end, perhaps the lost colony wasn't lost at all. Perhaps they were the first Americans to truly find themselves in the New World, shedding old identities to embrace new ones, and in doing so writing a chapter of American history that was lost to us, but lived on in the blood, bones, and stories of their descendants. The mystery of Roanoke remains unsolved, but it is not unknowable. The colonists left us breadcrumbs, CROATOAN carved in wood, artifacts buried in soil, genes passed through generations, and stories whispered from ancestors to descendants. We need only follow these clues with open minds and rigorous methods, accepting that the truth may be less dramatic than mythology but more human and more meaningful. The lost colony endures, and in enduring it keeps alive the memory of those 115 souls who vanished from Roanoke but never truly disappeared. They became something new, something neither entirely English nor entirely Native American, but a blend of both, a preview of the multicultural nation that America would eventually become.